Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid. A 5-cent package makes 2 quarts of Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid. 9 great flavors, the drink you love. Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid.
For the very best drink you ever made.
Kool-Aid, Kool-Aid.
Be sure that the envelope says Kool-Aid.
Previously on Commercial Chronicles, we took a look at what televised commercials are like in present day. Their treatment, their style, their faults, and I think it's safe to say it wasn't pretty, at least from an analytical standpoint. The commercials themselves are fine enough if you don't think about how they try to focus more on entertainment than long-term profit, but some of the ways they're prioritized over actual programming are kinda sickening. Why would anyone want to speed up or add more commercials to the reason people are even tuning in? Are we trying to make TV increasingly more obsolete? It's a shame. Really makes you want to go back to the good old days, doesn't it? Hey, that reminds me. It's time to begin our journey through the history of TV commercials. The ins, the outs, the important and the unimportant. No topic left untouched. Now what better way to commence that journey than with the very beginning? In this episode of Commercial Chronicles, we're going to discuss the birth of television advertising and its growth in popularity among advertisers. This will require a bit of background on certain things though, but it's pretty basic stuff, so it shouldn't be too much of a burden. I'm your host, Noah Bradford, and we now return to your regularly scheduled programming. Keep it here.
America runs on Bulova time.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
In this series, I'll be covering the topic of commercials by decades, years, companies, among other categories. But before then, I feel it would be best to start things off from the beginning. That beginning being the 30s, where television was still quite experimental and barely housed any actual series. For TV back in the 30s, things were incredibly different than what we know them as now. One of the biggest differences was the fact that there were no commercials. Imagine combining those times with our times. All your favorite cartoons, sitcoms, news programs, and whatever else, but with no advertisements interrupting them. Now that would be wild. Before commercials were ever implemented, TV shows filled entire uninterrupted blocks. Classic sitcoms like I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver were 30 minutes long. And if they wanted episodes of those shows to be reran today, they would have to be edited by 8 minutes to accommodate with the current broadcast format. When commercials were first introduced, they would only take up maybe a minute of a program's runtime if they were to appear. It wouldn't be until quite a while later that we would see the beginning of the standard 4-minute commercial break format that is used by every TV channel. But that's a story for a different video. Before we get into the birth of TV advertising, let's get into some background on a few things that culminate into one big piece of commercial history from July of 1941, starting with the beginnings of television. During the first years of television, no stations were given license by the FCC to run commercials on their programming, basically deeming TV commercials illegal at the time. It's honestly quite shocking thinking about how something as prominent and glorified as the TV commercial was once illegal, but that was indeed something that once happened. During this early period of TV though, a couple networks sneakily experimented with advertising before officially being allowed to. The first known occurrence of this happened when a Massachusetts station aired a sponsored video rebroadcast of a CBS radio program in 1930. Though no profit came from the advertisement within it, the FCC still prohibited the advert and fined the station. I'd assume this experiment to be not necessarily a deliberate attempt to break the rules, more so something they couldn't bother to change while adapting from radio to TV. Another occurrence of an experimental advertisement was on August 26 of 1939, when the first televised Major League Baseball game aired, with the Cincinnati Reds against the Brooklyn Dodgers. During the game, sports announcer Red Barber plugged 3 brands: Procter & Gamble Co., Saucony Oil, and General Mills. Thanks to them being the Dodgers radio sponsors, these companies were given ad spots during the game as a courtesy. Another thing to note here is the Bulova Watch Company. Founded and incorporated in 1875 by Bohemian immigrant Joseph Bulova, Bulova is a watch and clock making company based in New York City that is still thriving to this day. After becoming world-renowned in 1923 and making history with the first radio advertisement in 1926, Bulova was near to starting a domino effect that would immensely change television forever. Now that we have that out of the way, let's get into the focal point of the video, the birth of commercials. It wouldn't be until May 2nd of 1941 that the FCC would issue commercial licenses to 10 US stations, effective July 1st, making it legal for some networks to finally air commercials. While TV ads were still considered experimental in the early 1940s, Bulova stepped in as the the first and only company to try it out on the first day. On July 1st, 1941, at 2:29 p.m. before the Dodgers vs. Phillies baseball game, the station WNBT, now known as WNBC, aired this 10-second advertisement for Bulova watches.
America runs on Bulova time.
The budget for the commercial was $4 in air charges and $5 in station charges, totaling up to only $9. Though due to inflation, the current cost of the commercial is around $158, that doesn't entirely downplay the cheapness of the ad. While this price is pretty insane compared to the million-dollar budgets of today's Super Bowl ads, I can also see why the price was so low, considering the lack of actual substance in this 10-second still image with the narration and 2 fades slapped onto it. But despite the little flair it had, it was incredibly revolutionary. This one company standing up and charging in with their new ability would turn television on its head, though it might have been a bit of a slow turn.
We'll be right back on Nick. Nude crush cups. Check it out. I crush the alien. Well, I crush the director. I crush the tiki. I crush a Danimals Crush Cup. Huh? Yeah, new Danimals Crush Cups. You crush it and slurp it. Mmm, cool. No spoon? Nope. Just crush and slurp for a blast of fruity flavor. Mmm, awesome. I crush you crushing a Danimals Crush Cup. New Danimals Crush Cups. Danimals, get your blast on. Now back to the show on Nick.
Even after the great success of the Bulova commercial, television advertising wasn't that big in the 40s. There was still no such thing as a commercial break, and only a select handful of companies really stepped in to follow in Bulova's footsteps. Things slowed down even more for television altogether when the United States entered World War II. During this time, American television continued on a limited basis as the nation focused more on resources for the war. However, once the war ended, things picked up quite strongly. By the 50s, television became the leading ad medium, with spending increasing to over $1 billion by 1955. It was this decade that gave us the first Barbie doll commercial, the first animated commercials, among other cool things that I'll talk more at length about in an upcoming episode. By 1956, something new came along that would change things immensely: the video recorder. Before this time, reruns of television programming had to be broadcast through a kinescope, where a program is recorded by a camera with its lens directed towards a monitor with a show playing. Think of it as one of those gameplay videos where a person just puts their camera in front of their computer screen while they play, except a bit more professional. The introduction of the video recorder made it much easier for TV stations to air and re-air pre-recorded programs, that including commercials. This would make it easy for companies to produce animated TV shows and commercials, as well as being able to easily repeat commercials for what I'll be talking about in episode 2. The last thing I'd like to discuss is one big thing that both thrived and died in the 1950s: sponsored programming. Popularized by radio in the 1930s, television eventually carried this on starting in the very late 1940s with half-hour to hour-long shows like the Hallmark Hall of Fame, the Colgate Comedy Hour, and Kraft Television Theater. The goal of companies sponsoring shows was to allow for more of a chance of consumers purchasing their products, thanks to brand recognition from them watching and enjoying that brand's TV show. While some sponsors would change little about their programs, other sponsors would effectively decide for themselves the outcomes of shows they sponsored, such as the game shows The $64,000 Question and 21. That game show scandal marked an end for the peak of sponsored programming, and since the 50s, the term sponsored programs had a whole other meaning. The only way 50s-esque sponsored programming would live on was in the aforementioned anthology series Hallmark Hall of Fame, though it only airs new episodes a couple times a year. As these means of advertising faded away, something new came along that would set one of the biggest turning points in commercial history. On the next episode of Commercial Chronicles, we're going to take a look at what happened after the fall of sponsored programs. In the late 50s, sponsored program costs increased more and more, and economic pressure built up on ad agencies, leading to many of them nearly jumping ship. Before this could happen, NBC's executive at the time, Pat Weaver, had an idea that would truly change everything about TV. Find out what that is next time on Commercial Chronicles. I'm your host, Noah Bradford, and we'll be right back after the break.